Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah shir. We're holding in the Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mir Hashem, today we will be learning Daf Chav Ches Amid Aleph. We pick up today on the very top line of Chav Ches Amid Aleph in the words of, on the bottom line of Chav Zayin Amid Beis, Siman Reish Don Zayin, Sif Aleph, the bottom line. The Mechaber says, Ve'im Hitman. Our learning today should be Aschus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasunu Batzar Ubashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakoim Yerachem Alehem V'Yitzihem Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu L'Oiro Mishibud L'Geula, Hashta Bagala Uvizman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should be Aschus Refuah Shalema for David Ben Blima. He should have Refuah Shalema B'Seich Shar Chayei Yisrael. So, in the previous share, we began Siman Reish Nun Zayin, and we started discussing the Isser D'Rabbanan of Hatmana. What's Hatmana? Hatmana is when you take a pot of hot food and you want to insulate it to keep it nice and warm. So you prepared your food on Erev Shabbos for the Friday night Suda. It's nice and hot. Now what you want to do is you want to wrap it and insulate it to keep it hot for the Friday night Suda. And we learned in the beginning of Siman Reish Don Zayin here in Sif Aleph, we learned that you're not allowed to do Hatmana Lechatchila on Shabbos. Meaning, you have an uninsulated pot, and now on Shabbos, not before Shabbos, on Shabbos, you want to go ahead and insulate the pot. The Mechaber told us, on Shabbos, you're not allowed to do Hatmana, whether the materials that you're using are a davar shemoisif hevel, something that generates heat and is going to add heat to the food, or even if the materials that you're using are dvarim she'enoi moisif hevel. They don't generate heat and add heat. All they do is insulate the hot food and help it retain its heat. To do Hatmana Lechatchila on Shabbos, to go insulate a pot on Shabbos, that you're never allowed to do, no matter what kind of materials you are using. That was the first halacha that the Mechaber told us here in Sif Aleph. Then the Mechaber told us, how about if you're using a davar moisif hevel? If you're doing something that actually generates heat and adds heat to the food, then you're not allowed to do Hatmana even on Erev Shabbos. And like the Mishnah Berurah brought down from the Pri Megadim, even if it's Kodem Chatzos HaBoker, even if it's Friday at 11 o'clock in the morning, you cooked up your chicken soup and you want to insulate it well and you want to keep it hot for the Friday night Suda, you're not allowed to do Hatmana on Erev Shabbos with a davar shemoisif hevel, with materials that add heat to the food. You can't do that and leave it insulated going into Shabbos. You want to insulate it at 11 o'clock in the morning, you want to take it out of its wrappings before Shabbos, that you could do. But to insulate it with a davar shemoisif hevel and leave it in those wrappings going into Shabbos, that would be also to do even on Erev Shabbos. Now we go to the Mechaber here, bottom line, Chav Zayin Amud Beis. What happens if somebody did Hatmana Be'isser? What is now the status of the food? Says the Mechaber like this. Ve'im hikmin b'davar hamoisif hevel. Let's say somebody did Hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel. He might have done it on Shabbos itself, Be'isser. He might have done it on Erev Shabbos, also Be'isser, and then let it remain in the wrappings going into Shabbos. But now, on Shabbos, you have this food that is mutman, it's wrapped in a davar shemoisif hevel. What's the status of the food? Says the Mechaber, v'im hitman b'davar hamoisif hevel. If you do Hatmana with a davar hamoisif hevel be'isser, hatavshel aser afilu b'di'evet. That food is going to be aser even b'di'evet. You did it already, it's done, and now with Shabbos you have this insulated food. Maybe you even did it b'shaygeg. Maybe you forgot that it was aser. You went ahead and you did this Hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel, and you have it now on Shabbos. That food is aser. You're not allowed to use it. Continues the Mechaber, and the Mechaber says, however, v'dafka b'tzoynein shenischamin, this is only true if what you did was you took cold food and you did Hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel. So now the materials that you wrapped it in that generate heat and are moisif hevel, they reheat the food on Shabbos. In that case, what's happening is you're getting hana from the fact that you were over on the Isser D'Rabbanan. You're getting significant hana. You had cold food, which is becoming reheated on Shabbos from the hatmana b'davar shemaysev hevel. So in that case, even b'diavad, we're going to say that the food is aser. Oy shenitztamik v'yafaloi. Or if we're dealing with food, maybe it was hot when you did the hatmana, but it's mitztamik v'yafaloi. As it cooks more and it gets more dried out, that actually makes the food better. So again, if you did hatmana with a davar shemaysev hevel on a food that's mitztamik v'yafaloi, so now you're getting significant hana from being over on the Issa D'Rabbanan. You did hatmana with a davar shemaysev hevel, which is an Issa D'Rabbanan, and it's improving the food, either because the food was cold and it's reheating it, or because it's mitztamik v'yafaloi. So, mitztamik v'yafaloi, that means the food is improving. In that case, you got significant hana from the fact that you were over on the Issa D'Rabbanan, and therefore we're going to aser the food. Now, let's go further first. Aval, however, says the Mechaber, but what if you did hatmana with a davar shemaysev hevel, and when you did the hatmana, the food was already hot, and it's not a food that's mitztamik v'yafaloi. Any continued cooking from the heat being generated from this hatmana is not improving the food. All it's doing is it's retaining the initial heat. In that case, you're not really getting a significant hana from being over the Issa D'Rabbanan. The food is remaining hot, but the food was already hot. It's not mitztamik v'yafaloi, it's not getting reheated. In that case, says the Mechaber, mutter. Then, of course, it's aser to do this, l'chatchila. You're not allowed to do hatmana with a davar shemaysev hevel, even on Erev Shabbos. But b'diavad, if it was done, so now the food is going to be mutter on Shabbos, because we don't see that you got any significant benefit from the fact that you were over on this Issa D'Rabbanan. Now, before we even go into the Mishnah Berurah, there's one thing that I want to mention right away. The halacha that we just learned, you have somebody that's being over the Issa D'Rabbanan of hatmana b'davar shemaysev hevel on Shabbos. Okay? And we're analyzing what happens b'diavad. What's the status of the food? Is the food mutter or is the food aser? Says the Mechaber, as long as you got hana from the iser, so the food was cold and it got reheated, or it was mitztamik v'yafaloi, we're going to aser the food, even b'diavad, and the mashmois is, even if you did this b'shoigeg. Right? What do you mean b'diavad? What we mean b'diavad, if you take a look at the Be'er Heitev, Ois Cotton Beis, he says, Pirush afilu b'shoigeg. What we say b'diavad, what we mean is, you goofed, you forgot you're not allowed to do this. You thought it was mutter. You went ahead and you did it. We're going to aser the food b'diavad. So you were over on the Isser Atbana Midrabanan b'shoigeg, and we're going to aser the food, even though the hana that you got is not huge. The food was edible before. The food was mavushal called sarchai, or if you take a look in the Bir Halacha Dibra Masli Yesh Oimrim, it was at least mavushal kamacha ben drusai. So you're not getting a huge hana from the fact that you were over on Yisad Rabbanon. The food was already edible, but you are getting hana because either it's getting reheated or it's mitztamik v'yafaloi. And the Mechaber is saying, we aser the food b'diavad, and that means that it's going to be aser until Motzei Shabbos. Now, we had another halacha that's similar to this. In Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph, we learned the halacha of shehiyah. There are cases we are allowed to do shehiyah, there are cases you're not allowed to do shehiyah. And the Mechaber said, what happens if somebody did shehiyah on Erev Shabbos in an oifen where it was aser? So somebody left a pot on a kira that was not garfikatum. He left it on there on Erev Shabbos, and let's say the food was mevushal called sarchai, but it was mitztamik v'yafaloi. So the Mechaber said over there, if you did it b'shoigeg, the food is mutter. Why is the food mutter? So the Mishnah Berurah told us because the Mechaber holds that if the only gain that you got from doing the shehiyah midrabanan, the shehiyah that's also midrabanan, is mitztamik v'yafaloi, so the food was mavushal called sarchai, it was completely edible, the only gain that you got was that the chunk dried out a little bit more, it's mitztamik v'yafaloi. So the Mechaber holds that's not considered nene kol kach. You didn't get such significant hana from the fact that you were over on shehiyah midrabanan, and therefore the food is mutter b'di'evid. You did it b'shoigeg, you goofed, you shouldn't have done it, but b'di'evid we're not going to asa the food. That's the halacha that we saw in the Mechaber by shehiyah in Reish Dun Gimel. Over here, the Mechaber is being much more machmir. Over here by hatmana, which is also drabanan, says the Mechaber, you did hatmana midrabanan, and the food is mitztamik v'yafeloi, so you're gaining mitztamik v'yafeloi. The chalent is going to dry out a little bit more from the fact that you did hatmana with a davar shemoisef hevel. Says the Mechaber, therefore b'di'eved, the food is going to be aser. So here by hatmana, the Mechaber is being more machmir than he was in Reish Dun Gimel Sif Aleph by shehiyah. Very important to notice that. And indeed, if you take a look at the Berurah that I just mentioned, Berurah Ois Cotton Bays, the Berurah spells this out. He says, Va'afal gav de b'shachach v'shah, even though when it comes to being over on shehiyah midrabanan, where you were shachach, you forgot, so you did it b'shoigeg, matir b'simin Reish Dun Gimel Sif Aleph. Over there, the Mechaber says, the food was mevushal called tzarchay already. All you got from the fact that you did this shehiyah, which was aser, was mitztamik v'yafaloi. The food is mutter. We're not going to aser the food. Over here, you did hatmana when it was aser. You were over on hatmana derabanan. You did it b'shoigeg, afilu b'di'evid. Over here, the Mechaber says it's aser. Mikamakayim b'hatmana machmirin tvei. The Mechaber does not equate the din of hatmana to the din of shehiyah. The Mechaber is more machmir by hatmana than he was by shehiyah, and the Berurah brings this down from the Magen Avram. Okay, so the first thing that I'm just pointing out to you here is we have this basic halacha over here in the Mechaber, halacha number 1 that we're learning for today. We see that hatmana with a davar shemoisef hevel, materials that generate heat and add heat to the food, is also b'drabanan. Not only are you not allowed to do it on Shabbos, you're not even allowed to do it on Erev Shabbos and leave the hot food in those wrappings going into Shabbos. Says the Mechaber, what happens if you did this be'isser? If you did this be'isser, then b'di'eved, post facto, after you did it, the food is going to be aser, and that means the food is going to be aser until Motzei Shabbos. And Pashtus, what the Mechaber means when he says b'di'eved, he means you did it b'shoigeg. Otherwise, he could have just said, "V'im hitmin b'davar amoisef hevel aser." He doesn't have to say aser afilu b'di'evid. When he means aser afilu b'di'evid, you did it b'shoigeg. We're going to aser the food. When is this true? Only if you gained from the fact that you were over on the iser. What does that mean? You gained. Either you're dealing with cold food that got reheated on Shabbos from this hatmana that you did be'isr, or it was at least mitztamik v'yafaloi. So you gained the mitztamik v'yafaloi. Then we're going to ask for the food. But if you got no gain, if the food was hot when you insulated it, and it just retained its heat, then we don't see that you got too much gain, then we're not going to ask for the food. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Zayin. Ois Shenit Stamik. And the Mechaber says, when are we going to ask for the food? Only if the food is mitztamik v'yafaloi. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Pirish l'inyan di'eved. Realize that the Mechaber over here is talking about b'di'eved, after the fact. You went ahead and you did it b'shoigeg, we're not going to ask for the food. Aval l'chatchila, aser, afilu mitztamik v'raloi. But as far as the Yisad Rabbanon of doing hatmana with a davar shemoisef hevel, to go ahead and do it l'chatchila, you're not allowed to do it even if the food is mitztamik v'raloi. You're not allowed to go ahead and do hatmana with a davar shemoisef hevel. K'moshe kasa b'sif zayin, like we're going to see later on in the Mechaber in Sif Zayin. But if all it is oimid b'chamimusai, if the only thing that you're gaining from the hatmana that you did be'isr was that the food is going to retain its original heat, then we're not going to ask for the food. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Why? Hatam, the reason is to haloi ahani ma'isa of klal, because from the fact that you did a ma'isa of wrapping the food in a davar shemoisef hevel and leaving it in that insulation going into Shabbos, the Yisad Rabbanon that you did, you're not gaining anything. The food was hot. It is hot. You're not gaining. The Kasav of Magen Avram duhar din amatben b'Shabbos b'davar she'einoi moisef hevel. So too, you're not allowed to do hatmana on Shabbos even with a davar she'ena moisef hevel. So what if you did hatmana on Shabbos in a towel? It's a davar she'ena moisef hevel. Are we going to asa the food? Says the Mishnah Berurah from the Magen Avram. No, because of a Magen Avram, do I din amatman b'Shabbos b'davar she'ena moisef hevel? The shari b'di'evet. The food is going to be mutter if you did it. Avagav da asa isura, even though you were over on it. This is the Rabbanon. You're not allowed to do hatmana lechatchila on Shabbos, even when the davar she'ena moisef hevel. But we're not going to ask the food. Why? Because all you're gaining is the retention of the original heat. But you're not adding heat. You're not getting a significant enough benefit from the Yisra D'Rabbanan that we should ask the food. So that's the Shita over here of the Mechaber. And again, what we saw from the Be'er Heitev is the Mechaber is being more machmir by Hatmana than he was by Shehiyah. Now we turn to the Ramah. Says the Ramah, second line down here, Haggah. Yeshaimrim, however, there is a Yeshaimrim that says, the imshachach v'hitmin b'shoigig b'davar ha'moisef hevel. If somebody did hatmana b'davar shemoisef hevel, but he did it b'shoigig, he forgot he did it b'shoigig, shari lechel, we're not going to ask for the food. The food is mutter b'di'evet. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan Yeshaimrim the imshachach. The case that the Ramah gave was that somebody forgot. What does that mean that he forgot? Maybe he forgot that it was Shabbos. Or he did the Hatmana on Erev Shabbos, right? We said he cooked up his chicken soup Friday morning, and then he wrapped it in a davar shemoisef hevel at 11 o'clock in the morning on Friday. And then he forgot about it. So he forgot to take it out of the wrappings before Shabbos. So that's the case that the Ramah gave. That's the case that the Ramah gave, where he forgot. So he left it in the wrappings going into Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there's another case of shoygig. V'hu adin im shagag badin v'savar shamuter. Another case of shoygig would be that the guy went ahead and he did a hatmana with a davar shemoisef hevel because he didn't chazer the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah. And he thought that hatmana with a davar shemoisef hevel is mutter on Erev Shabbos. Oh, I'm doing hatmana on Erev Shabbos. I'm not doing hatmana on Shabbos. Now it's Erev Shabbos. I can do whatever I want. So he did hatmana with a davar shemoisef hevel because he forgot the halacha. That's also considered a shoygig. Gam zeh shoygig mikri. Ois katan yud. The Ramah says this Yeshaimrim says shari lechel. B'di'evet, post facto, you did it b'shoigeg, we're not going to ask for the food. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Tama Yeshaimrim hu, the rationale for this Yeshaimrim is, the Sfira lahu, they hold, the hatmana shava bazel l'shehiyah. This Yeshaimrim equates hatmana to shehiyah. The Mechaber is more machmir by hatmana than shehiyah. This Yeshaimrim equates hatmana and shehiyah. Explains the Mishnah Berurah. The pasuk HaMechaber el b'reish nun gimel sif aleph, like I told you earlier, in reish nun gimel sif aleph, the Mechaber paskind, the imshachach v'shaha, if you did shehiyah be'isr, but you did it b'shoigeg, you did it because you forgot. So then, afilu tavshel shemet stamik v'yafaloi. Even if you're dealing with a food that was mavushal called sarchai, but it's mitstamik v'yafaloi, so you're getting the gain of mitstamik v'yafaloi, muter lechel. The Mechaber said over there, mitstamik v'yafaloi, that's not such a tremendous gain. The food was mavushal called sarchai, so it was edible before, it's edible now. What did you gain from the Isser of Shehiyah, from being over on the Isser D'Rabbanan? Mitstamik v'yafaloi? That's not such a great hana, it's not such a great benefit, and therefore we don't answer the food. Over here, by Hatmana, he's more machmir. You gained the mitstamik v'yafaloi from doing Hatmana be'Isser, the Mechaber answers the food. The Yeshaimrim does not answer the food. He says, just like the Mechaber said, by Shehiyah, you didn't get such a tremendous benefit. And therefore, this Yeshaimrim says, b'di'evet, the food is mutter. He says the Mishnah Berurah, Das Magen Avram v'hataz v'hagra. It's the opinion of the Magen Avram, the Taz, and the Gra. The Mechaber Svirle, the Mechaber, who's more machmer over here, holds, Da afilu b'shoigeg, even if you did this hatmana be'isr b'shoigeg, Aser lechal ad Motzei Shabbos. The food is aser until Motzei Shabbos. Ulekach sasam hadavar. And that's why you don't find here in the lashon of the Mechaber that the Mechaber differentiated between Mezid and Shoigeg. What did the Mechaber say? The Mechaber said, Im hitman bedavar amoisev hevel, if you do hatmana with a davar shemoisev hevel, which is aser, hatavshel aser afilu b'di'evid. Post facto, the food is aser. Did he differentiate between Shoigeg and Mezid? No. Why? Because he holds even if you did it b'Shoigeg, the food is aser. Indeed, it's hard to learn the Mechaber any other way. So it would seem from the Mechaber very clear that even if you did it b'Shoigeg, the food becomes aser. And that's the opinion of the Magen Avraham, and the Gra. Nevertheless, says the Mishnah Berurah, near it would appear that in the case of need, you could rely on this yesh omrim of the Ramah, that if you did it b'Shoigeg, we're not going to aser the food. So if the only food, or the most significant food that you have for the Friday night Suda is your chicken soup, and you did hatmana with a davar shemoisev hevel, and you did it b'Shoigeg, so then we're not going to aser the food. You could rely on the shita of the Ramah over here. Shahar be'achrayim mitzadnim kain, because many achrayim take the position they paskin like this Ramah. Ubefrat imhay in the special called tzarchay. Certainly, if you're dealing with a food that was mamish bevushal cold tzarchay, wasn't only K'Michael ben Drusai, it was Mavushal Kol Tzarchai. The Balavach Yesh Bekil Lekamon Mesiv Zayin Bahago. We're going to see later on in this Siman and Siv Zayin, there are those shitas that hold, if you have a food that's Mamish Mavushal Kol Tzarchai, you're allowed to do Hatmana with a Davar Shemoisev Hevel on Erev Shabbos. That hold it's Mamish Mutter. So you have that shita who holds that by a food Mavushal called Tzarchai Hatmana with a Davar Shemoisev Hevel is always mutter on Erev Shabbos. And now you have the Ramah here, who holds even if it was aser to do the Hatmana, b'di'evid, if you did it b'Shoigeg, we're not going to aser the food. Al Kainei lahakmer bazeh le'inyan di'evid b'Shoigeg. Says the Ramah weiter. Third line down, near the middle of the line, in the parentheses. There's another Yesharmim that says, the kol zeh einay aser elikisha oisel tzarech laila. This shita says like this. You know what? This whole problem of hatmana, this whole iser of hatmana midarabanan, is only if you're doing the hatmana for the purposes of the Friday night Suda. But what if you're insulating the food not for the purposes of the Friday night Suda? You're insulating the food for the purposes of the Shabbos day Suda. Then, says the Ramah, according to these shitas, mutter lahatmin miba'oid yoim, it would be mutter to do hatmana on Erev Shabbos, not on Shabbos, on Erev Shabbos, b'davar shemoisev hevel. So if you want to do hatmana on your cholent, you heated up your cholent on Erev Shabbos. Now you don't want to keep it on a blech for going to Shabbos day. What you want to do is you want to do hatmana with some kind of a davar shemoisev hevel, a material that's going to add heat to the cholent. But you're doing it for Shabbos day. You're not doing it for Friday night. Then this shita holds you could mamish do that hatmana on Erev Shabbos even with a davar shemoisev hevel. This is the shita of the Mordechai. And continues the Ramah, he says, b'di'eved yesh lismay chalzeh. B'di'eved, if you did it, you could be samech on this shita, or b'vad shelo yehei ragel asis kain, but you definitely should not make a habit of doing this. So very interesting Ramah. So what this Ramah is saying is, we have this whole iser of hatmana midrabanan. Says the Ramah, there's a Yeshayim that says that this whole iser drabanan of hatmana, doing hatmana, let's say on Erev Shabbos, with a davar shemoisev hevel, that's only if the purpose of the hatmana is to have the food hot for the Friday night Suda. Not if you want to have it hot for the Shabbos day Suda. So you're not going to pay any attention to this Friday night. You're only coming to it on Shabbos day. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah and see why. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting your aleph. If you're doing the hatmana for Shabbos day, then there's no iser. Says the Mishnah Berurah Tam, the rationale for this would be, because let's remember what the reason for the Issa D'Rabbanan of Hatmana is. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Ikar Masha Asr L'Hatman B'Moisef Hevel. Why did the Chazal Aser doing Hatmana with a Davar Shemoisef Hevel on Erev Shabbos? You want to do Hatmana with a Davar She'ena Moisef Hevel? You want to wrap your chicken soup in towels on Erev Shabbos? You're allowed to do that. But if you want to do it with a davar shemoisif hevel, that's also even on Erev Shabbos. Why? What's the rationale? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hu mishum shema yavoy lahatmin beremetz. What we're afraid of is, if we're going to allow you to do hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel, you might come to use remetz. What's remetz? Remetz is ash that has burning embers in it. You might come to do hatmana with something that has burning embers. And why is that a problem? Once you're using an insulating material that mamish has burning embers in it, now you might come to do chitui. You might come to stoke those burning embers and make it burn hotter. And now you're going to be over for sure on Havara. Valkain, and therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, Kevin shematmin l'tzarech machar. If the whole purpose that you're doing the hatmana over here is not for Friday night, but for Shabbos day, then there's no place for this gzera. Because let's say when you do the hatmana on Erev Shabbos, the food is not even cooked to the extent of Michael ben Drusoi. This is very similar to the heter that we saw earlier by Shehiyah. What are one of the heterim that we saw by Shehiyah? One of the heterim we saw by Shehiyah is, if you want to do Shehiyah, if you want to leave a pot of food on a kira that's not gorifikatum, it has burning coals in it, but that pot has raw meat in it, then we say you're allowed to do the Shehiyah. The Shehiyah is not asur. Shehiyah with a davar chai, with raw meat, is mutter. Why? Because you're not going to come to be mechata b'gechalim. Why? Because you're mesiach das from it. You're not eating this food anymore tonight. You know it's not going to be ready tonight. For tomorrow, you're not going to come to be mechata b'gechalim for tomorrow. You know it's going to cook all night. So by tomorrow it's going to be ready. So too, this Yesh Omrim says, if you're doing hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel on Erev Shabbos, but you're not doing it for the Friday night Suda, you're mesiach das from this food for the Friday night Suda. You're insulating this cholent for the Shabbos day Suda. The whole reason Chazal aser hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel is because shema yechata b'gechalim. But if it's for the Shabbos day Suda, there is no chash shema yechata b'gechalim. It's for the Shabbos day Suda. It's not for the Friday night Suda. It's going to be ready by tomorrow anyway. So you're not going to come to me mechata b'gechalim. That's the rationale, says the Mishnah Berurah, of this shita. And therefore, continues the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, V'hu adin, this yesh armor would also hold the mutral lahatmin bin espashal called tzarchai. They would also hold that it would always be mutter to do hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel on Erev Shabbos if the food that you're doing the hatmana on is mavushal kol tzarchai. It's fully cooked. Because why would you be mechata b'gechalim? The food is fully cooked. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this Yesh Armim would say, if you have a food that's mavushal called tzarchai that you're planning on eating on Friday night, you could do the hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel. Why? Because why would you be mechata b'gechalim? It's mavushal kol tzarchai. So that's how cool this Yesh Omrim is. And this is based on, and it's very similar to, the very cool opinion when it comes to this hatmana that we're going to see later on in Sif Zayin. So it turns out that we have a Yesh Omrim over here in the Ramah that's very, very makel by hatmana. This Yesh Omrim is saying, you have food that's mavushal called tzarchai that you want to eat Friday night, you could do hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel on Erev Shabbos because there's no fear shema yechata b'gechalim. You have a food that you're doing hatmana on for the Shabbos day Suda, not for the Friday night Suda. You could do hatmana with a davar shemoisif hevel on Erev Shabbos. Again, because there's no fear, shema yechata b'gechalim. Very, very cool opinion. But then the Ramah says, you could be saimech on this shita b'di'evid, but you definitely should not make a habit of being saimech on this shita. Why not? Says the Mishnah Berurah cut Yud Beis, Shelo Yeh Ragel. Mashma, the implication is, the Imhu Ragel, if you make a habit out of using this shita, using this kula, af b'di'evet aser. You make a habit out of doing this, we're going to aser your food, even b'di'evet. Vatam, the reason is, the me'ikar adin ein lehem makom l'hayei shoymrim. Me'ikar adin, says the Mishnah Berurah, there really is no basis for this yesh oimrim. K'moshe kasav agra u'sha'ari poskim, like the gra and many other poskim write. V'chein kasav, the hayesh b'kilim d'lakamon ein lehem makom b'din. And indeed, the kuladik opinion that we're going to see later on in Sif Zion, these achrayim are going to say also that it's very hard to find a basis for this kuladik opinion. And indeed, the Ramah is going to say later on that unless you live in a place where there's an established minig to be saivach hadis kula, you should not be saivach hadis kula. Now, what's behind this? What's behind this is something that we've already covered in today's shir, and that is hatmana the equal of shehiyah, or is hatmana more chamor than shehiyah? These yesh omrims are basing themselves on the idea that hatmana and shehiyah are the same. Now, from learning all about shehiyah in Siman Reish and Gimel, we saw that any time you could obviate the fear of Shem Yechata B'Gechalim, we could be makel by shehiyah. So if you have a kira that's gar for katam, there's no fear Shem Yechata B'Gechalim. If you have food that's raw right before Shabbos, we have no fear Shem Yechata B'Gechalim. According to the Mechaber, if you have food that's mavushal called tzarchai and it's mitztamik viraloi, there's no fear of Shem Yechata B'Gechalim. According to the Ramah, you have food that's mavushal, not even mavushal called tzarchai, but it's mavushal kamaycha ben drusai, half or even maybe a third of the way cooked, there's no fear Shem Yechata B'Gechalim. So in all of those cases, we said that shehiyah becomes mutter. We saw another kula. We saw when you have a kira that's closed and it's tuach petit. We're not afraid you're going to break open the kira and be machata b'gechalim. So we saw over and over and over again that when we have things that obviate the chashash of Shem Yechata b'gechalim, we take off the isser of shehiyah. If you hold that the isser of hatmana is the equal of the isser of shehiyah, then if there's no fear of Shem Yechata b'gechalim, so that we could be matir hatmana even with a davar shemaisiv hevel. So you're doing hatmana for the Shabbos day Suda, there's no fear Shem Yechata b'gechalim. We'll be matir hatmana with a davar shemaisiv hevel on Erev Shabbos. You have a food that's mavushal called tzarchai, we're not afraid that you're going to be mechata b'gechalim. So we could be matir hatmana with a davar shemaisiv hevel on Erev Shabbos even for the Friday night Suda. But these achrayim, the Gra, others, they say it's very hard to find a basis for equating hatmana and shehiyah, because we paskin like the Rabbeinu Tam, so machlokes Rishonim, we seem to paskin like the Rabbeinu Tam, who says that hatmana is more chamor than shehiyah, and they are not the same. Okay, now we turn to Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber Sif Beis, afilu tavshil shenispashal kol tzarchai aser lahatmin b'Shabbos. Till now, we've been talking about doing hatmana on Erev Shabbos. We saw right away in the beginning of Sif Aleph here, ein taimnin b'Shabbos, afilu b'davar she'ein moisef hevel. To do hatmana on Shabbos, you can't do hatmana on Shabbos, even with a davar she'ein moisef hevel. Says the Mechaber here in Sif Beis, afilu tavshil shenisbashal kol tzarchai. Even if you're dealing with a food that's fully cooked, aser lahatmin b'Shabbos, you're not allowed to do hatmana on Shabbos, afilu b'davar she'ein moisef hevel. Even if you're dealing with insulating materials that do not generate and add heat. Says the Mishnah Berurah cutting Yud Gimel. Aser lahatmin b'Shabbos. When we call makam b'di'evet shari v'chanal b'sif cotton ches. But let's say you did hatmana on Shabbos with a davar she'enoi moisef hevel. So you did that hatmana on Shabbos, b'di'evet, we're not going to aser the food like we're going to see later on in Sif Cotton Ches. Now we come to a very interesting piece of Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, Ubikamokan, nevertheless, having said that you're not allowed to do hatmana on Shabbos, even with a davar she'enoi moisef hevel, Ubikamokan, nevertheless, losum kelim al hatavshil. Let's say you want to put a keli on top of the cooked food. Kidei lishamroi min ha'achbarim. You have food sitting out, and you're afraid achbarim, rodents or bugs, might come to the food. So you want to protect the food. Your interest is not maintaining the heat of the food. Your interest is protecting the food. Oy kidei shelo yistanef ba'afruris. Or you're afraid the food is going to get dirty. The house is dusty, and you're afraid dirt, whatever it is going to fall on the food. So you don't want to protect the heat of the food. You're not trying to insulate the food. You just want to cover the food. Generally speaking, we keep food covered. You have a cake out on the countertop, you cover the tin with tinfoil, or you put it in a closed cake taker. We don't generally just leave food exposed out. You cover your food. So if somebody wants to cover his food, and his food happens to be hot, and by covering the food, incidentally, whatever cover you use is also hatmana, right? You are covering the food, and it probably will also aid in helping the food retain its heat. But that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it to cover the food. That's mutter, says the Mechaber. When we come makom losum kelim ala tafshel kedei l'shamrim min achbarim oy kedei shelo yistanif ba'afruris shari. That's mutter. She'ein zeh kemat min lahachem. Because over here you're not doing it to keep in and insulate the heat. Ela kishomer v'noisim kiso yalaktera. All you're doing is you're covering your food, which is a perfectly natural, normal thing to do. V'ayin la'el siman reish nun gimel. Now, let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah, and I'll tell you something interesting that the Rishiv Zatzal, Rav Moshe Feinstein Zechitzadim Kosher Vrach, says in the Igris. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in your Dalit. Losum kelim. The words of the Mechaber are, if you want to put a keli on top of your food. Now, when we think of a keli, a utensil, we think of like a pot, or a 9x13 tin, or the cover of a pot, or the top of a cake taker. You're putting a keli over your food. Says the Mechaber, you want to put a keli on top of your food in order to protect your food? You're allowed to do that. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu afilu begodim. This would be true even if you're talking about articles of clothing, or towels, or blankets. You want to cover it, which is mamish, what you would use for hatmana. Hainu afilu begodim shema'amidim es hachoyim shel haktera shel yitztaneh. The same type of insulating materials. A davar she'eino ma'asav hevel, a towel, a blanket, a coat. You could cover up the food with that if you're doing it to protect the food, not to insulate it. Afilu hachi shari. This is mutter. Kevan she'eino mechavin lazeh, since you're not doing it for the purpose of insulating the food and keeping the food hot. Now, the Rishiv Zatzal says a very interesting chiddush over here. The Rishiv Zatzal is very medayik in the lashon of the Mechaber. The Mechaber does not say what the Mishnah Berurah says. The Mishnah Berurah over here says that the reason this is mutter is because of your kavana. Your kavana was not to keep the food hot. Your kavana was to protect the food. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says. The Mechaber doesn't say a word about kavana. The Mechaber says over here, you want to cover your food with kalim in order to protect it. That's mutter. Why, says the Mechaber? She'ein zeh kemat min lahachem, because this is not like insulating food to keep it hot. Ella, what is it like? Kishomer v'noisid kisei alaktera. This is like protecting and covering your food. Okay, and why does that make it mutter? If you're insulating it by covering it and protecting it, why is it mutter? It's clear from the Mechaber. What the Mechaber is saying is, there is no Isser D'Rabbanan on putting your food in a container. Something that's made to be a container for food. There's no Isser Hatmana. That's called putting your food in a container. Putting your food in a container is mutter. You're not mechuyev to have your food exposed. You're allowed to put your food in a container. If it happens to be that the container is also going to keep the food warm, that's okay. There's no Isser Hatmana on that. Whenever you're putting your food in its container, that is mutter. The Rishiv Zatzal in a tshuva says for this reason, you could put hot soup in a thermos. Now, what's a thermos, Rabbi Isai? A thermos is something that keeps food hot. But the Rishiv Zatzal says a thermos is a container for food. It's a bottle that you keep food in. You're allowed to go ahead and put the food in a container because you're putting it in a container. It's true that it will also help keep the heat in. But that's okay, because it's a container for food. You're allowed to do that. Says the Rishiv Zatzal, this noifach mishaloi, this additional piece of information that the Mishnah Berurah adds, which is that the reason he adds two things to Mishnah Berurah. He says, the Mechaber says you could put the food under a keli. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you could also cover the food with begodim. So that's an addition of the Mishnah Berurahs. The next addition of the Mishnah Berurahs is, why is that mutter? Because you don't have kavana to keep it hot. Your kavana is to cover the food. Explains Rav Moshe, you know what the Mishnah Berurah is saying? The Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this. The Mechaber is telling you that to put the food in a container is always mutter. It doesn't matter what your kavana is. That's always mutter. Because there's no Isser D'Rabbanan of Atmana on putting food in a container. So if you're putting the food in a container, it's always mutter. But what if you're not putting the food in a container? What if you're wrapping the food in a coat? A coat is not a food container. Oh, over here there could be an Isser of Hatmana. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but if you're doing it not for kavanah to keep the food hot, but you're wrapping the food in a coat in order to keep it clean, because you want to cover your food and you have nothing else to cover it with, that's also mutter, even though it's not a food container. But since you're doing it to protect the food and not to insulate the food, that's also mutter. That's an extra chiddush that the Mishnah Berurah is adding. Sif Gimel. Says the Mechaber. Eloheim dvarim hamaisifim hevel. We're differentiating over here between materials that are moisif hevel, that add heat, and materials that are not moisif hevel. What are these different materials? Says the Mechaber, and this is based on a Mishnah and a Brisa in Masechta Shabbos. Eloheim dvarim hamaisifim hevel. The following materials are considered to be materials that generate and add heat. Pesailes shel zeisim, the remaining pulp of pressed olives, oishel shumshimin, or the pulp of pressed sesame, vizevel, or manure, umelach, salt, visid, sid is lime, vachoil, or sand, bein lachim, bein yaveshim. These materials, whether they're damp, moist, which right away you could understand retains more heat, or even if they're dry, these are all materials that are considered to be moisif hevel. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Tezvav. Oishel shumshimin. The Mechaber equates the psilus of zeisim and the psilus of shumshimim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, they're not always halachically the same. Even though, when it comes to the question of doing hatamana inside this material, so you want to take a pot and you want to put it inside a pile of olive pulp or sesame pulp, so over there the halacha is the same. They have the same halacha. But there still is a halachic difference between olive pulp and sesame pulp. The b'shumshimin, when it comes to sesame pulp, or the other materials that are listed over here that we're calling dvarim shemaisifim hevel, dafka lahatmin l'soichan aser. Hatmana by those materials is only aser when you're insulating the pot inside these materials. Avalim hitmin bedavar hamutter, but if you do hatmana on a pot in a way that's mutter, going for example, bekupa shel tzemer, you have a box, and the box is lined with wool. Wool is not considered to be a davar shemaisif hevel, so that hatmana would be mutter. You take a pot, you put it in a box that's lined with wool, with a cover that's lined with wool. That's perfectly mutter hatmana on Erev Shabbos, because it's hatmana with a davar she'ena moisef hevel. Ukahagavdon, or any other type of oifid shel heter, mutter lahaniach hakupa aleihen. You would then be allowed to take this insulated box and put it on top of a pile of, let's say, sesame pulp. Because you're not doing hatmana inside the sesame pulp, you're doing the hatmana in a wool-lined box. You're putting the wool-lined box on top of a pile of sesame pulp. Aval al gefes shel zeisim, but on a pile of olive pulp, aser lahaniach. You wouldn't be allowed to put that box there, the chamimi tvei, because olive pulp is said to generate a lot more heat, umaisif and hevel lamayla, derech hakupa, and the heat will go up and penetrate into the box, lahakdera, into the pot of food, and this is based on the Gemara, Mem Zayin Amid Beis. Continues the Mechaber. Now, v'teven, straw, v'zagin, or the skins of pressed grapes, umuchin, or soft materials, soft pieces of unprocessed wool or unprocessed cotton or the like, v'asavim, or grass. Bizman sheshloshtan lachin, if these three materials are moist. Now, why are we saying three? We saw four: teven, zagin, muchin, asavim. The Mishnah Berurah says that the Mechaber considers teven, straw, and zagin, he lists them as one. So when these materials are lachin, if they're moist, then those are also considered to be dvarim shemoisifim hevel. So if you have damp straw, damp grape seeds, damp muchin, damp grass, those would be considered dvarim hamoisifim hevel, and therefore hatmana in them would be also even on Erev Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah cotton tezayim v'teven, beidibu araych, whether you're talking about long pieces of straw, or it's cut up into small pieces, which you would think that would be more dense, it would generate more heat. Zagin are the grape seeds. Umuchin, what are muchin? Kol davar rach kare muchin, soft fabrics. Kigoin tzemer gefen, cotton, utlishas tzemer rach, raw pullings of unprocessed wool, shel behema, ugriras begadim beluyim, or little, pieces of worn out fabric. The Mechaber is counting teven and zagin as one. Yotes lachin, if these are damp, moist, they're considered dvar ma'asifim hevel. Yesh ben hevel harbe yoser miyavation. When they're damp, they have more heat than when they're dry. Umistimas HaMechaber mashma, and from the general way that the Mechaber writes this, it is implied, debein lachin machmas atzmon, whether they're damp with their own natural moisture, ubein lachin machmas davar acher, or they're damp because they got wet. Shneim asurim, they're both asur because they're both considered to be dvarim shemisifim hevel. Amnam kama achronim miskimu dedafka lachin machmas atzmon. Many achronim conclude that this is only true if they still retain their natural moisture. Shehei mechama mois yoser milachin machmas mashke shenafla alein misha yavshu. We're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shem should send Yeshua for his parnasset sheduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Kol Tzedek. B'mehera v'yameinu amen. Be well.